it's being portrayed as something that looks like quite a good thing, where we're introducing design codes. But what it's really doing is it's making the local government accountable and saying, look, you can't keep refusing these things on these spurious reasons on buildings that don't really have much merit and areas that don't have much merit. So what they're saying is, adopt a design code, tell us which areas do you think need to be protected and which don't, and that gives you as an investor assurance as to, okay, they don't really mind using this to PD in this area, so I'm going to go there. And reading between the lines, that's what they're trying to do. Design codes are a way for the government to say, you must refer to a design code so that every investor like you has assurance that they can use certain parts of PD in certain areas of their authority that they're less concerned about with regards to that PD. So that's a really big part that not many people will pick up. If you want to learn more about the planning process and how you can unlock value out of any property, click the link below to learn more. Alright, so last month the government proposed changes to the General Permitted Development Order. The General Permitted Development Order is where you can take advantage of PD, you may have heard it, permitted development, whereby you can do changes without needing planning permission. Well, over the last decade or so, the permitted development order has slowly grown, and now suddenly quite quickly growing into a really important where you can deliver immense amount of housing now, whereas before anything where you wanted to deliver any houses or anything like that required the full planning permission process. There was this drawn out process that took a long time. So the permitted development order now is really expanding, where you can now deliver houses, do massive extensions, changes of use, extensions upwards that include flats or not if you don't want it to be. The government are looking to expand it even more. So it's really important document to learn. It's a really interesting topic to follow because it's ever changing. Every year there seems to be more discussions about it and new proposed changes to it, whereas right now they've just closed the consultation on it. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of it, but this video is going to walk through what some of the key things of what they proposed and things for you to keep an eye out for, because as soon as they are adopted you can effectively take advantage of them straight away, and there's some real quite big ones in there, so we'll get started with them. The first proposed change is around Class MA permitted development, which is where you can change anything from Class E, which is a use class, to residential. That includes office, retail and other things like that, to residential. Now historically that was just office to residential. That was the big thing back in when the recession first hit back in 2008. The government were looking about ways to increase housing and take advantage of all this office space that was vacant now, and they introduced that permitted development right. Well, that has just stuck within the permitted development order ever since then, and it's changed and morphed and a lot of things have happened to it since. The biggest thing that changed most recently was it included Class E, which is more than office, which includes, like I've said already, offices and retail. So Class E encompasses a huge amount of uses now, and you can change that to residential. Now, the main change that they are proposing is that currently you can only use 1,500 square meters of floor space to change to residential. So, you have an office space and you could only change 1,500 square meters of it, whatever, right? So that obviously limited the amount that you could change, protected large floor plate office buildings where 1,500 square meters was just like a small portion of that building, where now they are proposing to change it to 3,000 square meters. That is a lot of units potentially. Just like I said, since the recession, any new units generally needed planning permission. That was a rule, so it needed some sort of planning control. So now, we're talking about deliver tens and tens of units under PD, and PD allows you to use it's like a pared back planning application where the council can only consider certain matters. So they can't ask for contributions towards affordable housing. They can't ask for legal agreements. They can't put on reasonable conditions and stuff like that. Whereas the planning process can do that. And critically, there's also a time limit on it. You can benefit from this permitted development change and within a time frame, so that all of a sudden you've got certainty over when you're going to get permission, and if all the conditions and the circumstances are right, you could effectively guarantee that you're going to get permission to residential. But now for 3,000 square meters, that is a huge amount of floor space. So keep an eye on that. So these consultations, They do change once they get feedback from people. It does depend on the massive amount of kickback they're going to get. I don't know what the kickback has been, but I'd imagine, reading between the lines of all the changes they're proposing, they're continuing the main ones that are being exercised right now. They're also expanding all of them. So reading between the lines, as we all know from the news that's hitting you in the face every day, there's a huge pressure on the need to deliver housing in this country. And the government clearly can't do that through local government. So what they're doing is they're forcing it through permitted development changes. So I'd be very surprised if all of this is kicked back and thrown away in some form or another. One of the things, or two or more of the things that I'm going to talk about, are going to go through, and they are going to be expanded because the country is dying in need of housing. So keep an eye on this space. It's really big. So that's only the first one. Class MA is going to be expanded from 1,500 to 3,000 square meters. Now, linked to that, within the same one, within Class MA, is that historically the building had to be vacant for a certain period of time before you could apply. So you'd need to demonstrate that the building has been vacant, it couldn't be let, no one was interested in it, there's no demand for it, so let's go for residential. Now what they're proposing now is to remove that. So that suddenly means that someone could leave, a tenant could leave an office building tomorrow, and then the next day you could change that to residential. Now that sounds really great for an investor, and it does, I can see why it does. But once you change something to residential, it's very, very hard to bring it back. So if all of a sudden in a couple of years there's a massive demand for office space and it's all been lost because of these permitted development changes, it's going to be really, really hard to sort out. So they might be forcing through housing now and making it quicker for people, but in the future, if people need commercial space and floor space and like that, and they have to go through the planning process, that's just kicking the issue down the road into a different use class. But what's clear is that housing is the clear priority of the government, and they're using the permitted development order to really force through housing. So an interesting one is the use of Class M and Class N, which is allowing you to change the use of payday shops and betting offices to residential. Now currently there is a restriction of 150 square meters, so that effectively what they're trying to do is keep the use class on the high street but also allow for housing. Now what they're proposing to do now is double that floor space to 300 square meters or remove it altogether. And this is all going to be done without planning permission. Remember that. So this is permitted development. This is things that, under a certain time frame you can get planning permission for things, and it's only going to be limited to a certain matters, and the council can't control all the other things that they normally do through the planning application process, which takes forever. So this is another case of they've identified a use class, they want to change it to residential, and they're using legislation to bypass local government control to force through housing. And the other one is Class G, permitted development. This allows you to change the use of the upper floors of, so if the ground floor is Class E, so retail or office or whatever, they're allowing you, so currently you're allowed to change the upper floors into 2 units. Under the proposed changes, that's going to be expanded to 4. So Class G is a really good one because it doesn't have as many conditions required for it to be used, unlike Class MA, which does have quite a few things that you need to meet. But Class G is a kind of much lower barrier to entry for people. But the drawback with it is that you could only deliver 2 units, whereas now you can deliver 4, and that makes it much more lucrative, and also makes it much more lucrative in an investment sense. But in a planning sense, Class G as it is currently, there are fewer requirements that you need to meet. So it's an interesting one to keep an eye on. Class Q is where you can turn agricultural buildings into houses. Now currently there's a restriction to only deliver 5, and what they're saying is there's confusing terminology on how big those homes could be, whereas now they're just going to change it to increase the amount of floor space that you can deliver, but also delivering up to a maximum of 10 homes on these agricultural buildings, which opens up a huge amount of opportunity. And lastly, what I'll end on is that the current consultation is proposing the use of design codes. So what that refers to is that currently whenever you use a certain class of PD and it says that, so for instance, if you're adding stories onto a building, they'll say in principle it's okay, but subject to the external appearance of the building. And that has allowed councils to really use that kind of loophole in it to kind of, does it include the building, does it include the townscape, and it's allowed councils to really expand the kind of considerations, basically giving them more ammunition to refuse something they don't like. Bear in mind that councils don't like the fact that they can't control certain development, so certain parts of the PD are kind of really problematic for councils, particularly when you're going up, because they are the most impactful on local areas. So if you think about Part 20, this is the part in particular I think it's referring to. Part 20, you can go up 2 stories and add flats on many buildings, including things like detached blocks of flats. Now, if you as an investor see an opportunity where you can go up and you think design-wise it's borderline, it's more often than not that councils will refuse it, and they will refuse it based on the external appearance of the building, and they'll look to guide you to apply for planning permission where they could control the development and introduce all these different types of contributions and things. So that external appearance is kind of a loophole for councils, whereas now the government is asking them to refer to a design code. So instead of it saying the impact on the external appearance of the building, the permitted development order is likely going to say it must be in accordance with the design code. So a design code is going to be something that the council has to pull together, really think about the areas that they want certain designs to be in place, and it's going to be they consult on, and it's going to be something that's adopted as a standalone document. That's going to be at one point in time the design code that is being referred to. So when you get to Part 20 in the future and it says be in line with the design code that the council has adopted or whatever, that design code must be very specific about where those things are allowed to be placed and where they're not. So to my mind, it's being portrayed as something that looks like quite a good thing where we're introducing design codes, but what it's really doing is it's making the local government accountable and saying, look, you can't keep refusing these things on these spurious reasons on buildings that don't really have much merit and areas that don't have much merit. So what they're saying is, adopt a design code, tell us which areas do you think need to be protected and which don't, and that gives you as an investor assurance as to, okay, they don't really mind using this PD in this area, so I'm going to go there. And reading between the lines, that's what they're trying to do. Design codes are a way for the government to say you must refer to a design code so that every investor like you has assurance that they can use certain parts of PD in certain areas of their authority that they're less concerned about with regards to that PD. So that's a really big part that not many people will pick up. Design codes is a really big thing to keep an eye on. Once the design code is adopted, check which areas the council are trying to protect and which they're not. And if they're not trying to protect certain areas and you see an area that you think has merit to use PD, then by all means use it, because the government is saying the council has to refer to a design code. And if the design code says what I just said, then you've effectively got a green light. So that's an interesting addition. And if you want to learn more about the planning process and permitted development rights and any new updates that are happening, so that you could arm yourself, so that you know that when you see a property you understand the planning process, you know what its opportunities are, you know what its drawbacks are. From my time working in a local council, I got to see the inside, and I got to see how councils work, and I got to see what works and what doesn't. So if you click on the link below, you'll start to learn more about that process, so that when you come to invest in your next property, you'll have the kind of tools behind you to know that actually I understand something that a lot of people turn their back to because the planning process is so complicated and so confusing and so opaque. So if you click the link below, learn more, you will start to understand the planning process and you'll be ahead of the game, ahead of all others.